look at today is we're going to look at trauma. I mean, we're going to look at addiction disorders, including substances and behaviors, through the lens of understanding it as a response to pain, to trauma, to emotional distress. We're going to recognize or explore why people use substances and behaviors as a way of self-medicating. And we're also going to look at it through a trauma-informed lens that's hopefully a little bit more compassionate and a trauma-informed approach to addiction recovery. So the thing that I'm often heard saying to my clients is that the problem is the problem. And for a long time, we have treated addiction as the problem. And I'm not meaning to say by that trauma isn't, or addiction isn't a problem, but it isn't often the problem. I often say that the problem that contributes to addiction disorders is unresolved trauma, nervous system dysregulation, or some other kind of distress. And so as we go through our conversation today, the question that I really want to highlight is, rather than asking why the addiction, I want us to frame it as, what if we asked what the problem is that addiction disorders solve? And what is the addiction helping fix or medicate? And so when we look at that, one of the things that I want to talk about is the ways that addiction has been understood historically, that we think of addiction as a choice. People choose to use substances or behaviors, that there's an element of volition in that they pick up and they continue to pick up their substance or behavior. That somehow that ability to choose should mean that they should be able to unchoose it. There's also the concept of willpower, that people should be able to just employ the idea of willpower. My will can override that desire, that thought, that craving, that whatever. So sometimes people approach addiction disorders as if that person had more willpower. They should be able to choose differently. Motivation sometimes is called into question. And how many times have we heard, or at least I have in my experience of working in addiction treatment, that people haven't hit their bottom yet? That somehow people don't have enough motivation to stop their using because they haven't experienced significant consequences. And that is a way that we often frame it, or we look at it as a moral failing. Historically, that's been one of the strong ways, the strong lenses that we've looked at addiction disorders, that it's somehow a moral problem, or that it's even genetic. You know, the studies that are quoted often say that if somebody has a parent who's an alcoholic, they're more at risk genetically to become somebody that struggles with an alcohol use disorder themselves, which negates or minimizes the impact or the trauma that there is growing up with a parent who is a substance user. And so we can kind of look at all of those different ways that people have approached trying to understand addiction disorders. And I would encourage us to look at it more as substance use and addiction disorders are really an attempt to cope. They're an attempt to survive, or they're an attempt to find relief. And rather than there being the question of, why does this person have the addiction? The question might be better, what is this person trying to soothe? What might they be trying to escape? What might they be trying to numb? Or what might they be trying to change? And we can put up the slides. I think there's a second or third slide that might fit in with what we're looking at right now. And I want to give you two examples that I'm going to come back to in a moment. I just had a conversation with a man in his 60s who experienced profound trauma. We can move to the second one. Yeah, so as we look at this, the conversation that I had with a man in his 60s just this weekend, not a client, but somebody I know as a friend, and he has profound trauma. He was adopted as an infant and then adopted into a family that his parents were abusive to him. And he just said bluntly that by the time he was 11 or 12, he was already using alcohol to just try to cope with what was going on in his life at that moment. So I mention him, and that makes sense. We can kind of see the progression and the type of extreme pain that a man like him experienced. But then I also want to share another story of a woman who is in her 40s. She's a medical professional. She's a mom of adolescents, and she's a marathon runner. And she is somebody who is also a high functioning person with anxiety. And she pushes herself relentlessly. And she is a perfectionistic person and is always giving and always caring and always pouring out to other people. And one of the ways she learns to shut down and give herself a break is with alcohol. And alcohol, unfortunately, increases her anxiety, which pushes her into an even greater pattern of numbing or soothing the anxiety she feels, the self-judgment she feels. So I'm going to come back to these two people at the, closer to the end of our conversation today. And, what I want to say is alcohol gave both of them a break, but we could also fill in the blank with any other substance or any other behavior. And so there's a lot of different common experiences that people, are trying to self-medicate. There's many behaviors. There's many common experiences that that people are trying to self-medicate. And if we go to the third slide, these are just some of the words that come to mind when I think of all of the different things people are self-medicating. For example, anxiety. Statistics tell us that somebody with an anxiety disorder, whether it be generalized anxiety, a panic disorder, they are 2 to 4 times more likely to develop an alcohol or substance use disorder. So they're at higher risk. And then statistics also tell us that the anxiety disorder developed first in about 75% of the people. So anxiety is a significant thing we need to be screening for when we are trying to look at why people might be numbing or soothing. Shame, that profoundly painful experience of disconnection from ourselves and other people, the shame that we feel when you're living outside of the desire, your best self, when you're acting outside of what you know you should be doing and how you are harming people you care about. Shame is a profound experience and common in substance use and addiction disorders. That's something people are often trying to medicate. There are trauma symptoms. As a trauma therapist, I often say that people are medicating one of two things. They're medicating the two big symptoms that come from trauma, things like flashbacks, big emotional reactions, hypervigilance, lots of discomfort in their body that is a leftover from their trauma experience. Or they are also trying to shut down and numb sometimes, which is the other sort of cluster of symptoms in trauma where people are self-medicating to try to shut down. So trauma symptoms are a really common reason people self-medicate. Physical pain, exhaustion, like the client that I just spoke about, who is the medical professional, it gives her a break at the end of the day. Sometimes people use alcohol to unwind at the end of the day, at the end of a stressful day. It's how they give themselves a bit of a break. People often use substances because they have untreated insomnia, and their cannabis or alcohol helps them fall asleep. which creates other problems in the long run. And so I'm just trying to flesh out some of the more reasons that we need to be looking at that underlie the behavior of using substances or behaviors. And these are just some of the ones that I highlight, because the question really is, or the comment that I want to make is that relief often becomes more important than pleasure. That people aren't using, by the time they get to be dependent on their substance or behavior, they're not using it for pleasure. They're using it for relief. And it's really important to ask those questions and to be curious about what is going on underneath that people might be seeking relief for. Substances and behaviors do temporarily relieve distress. That's why they get used. And they're very effective at providing these small little windows of relief. But anyone who has experienced addiction, anyone who's worked alongside of and supported somebody with addiction, we all know that that temporary bit of relief that somebody gets from any of these things that they're trying to escape, that little bit of relief is quickly replaced by the distress of using, the physical challenges, the relational challenges, the emotional pain. The cycle of addiction is so distressing for people, which makes us really question and pay more attention to what is the relief that they're so desperate to get, that they keep engaging in this pattern of using and addiction disorders that is so distressing. How can we help them get relief for what it is that caused that problem in the first place? And so I hope that gives you an idea of ways that we can be just slightly more curious, that this isn't, addiction disorders are rarely about pleasure. Sometimes it is. Sometimes people get caught in that search for pleasure and it leads to an addiction disorder. I don't want to discount that can happen and sometimes does. My experience has been that it's far more about seeking a means of soothing or numbing or easing distress. And it's great that we're having these conversations that open up those opportunities to be curious, to give ourselves more ways of understanding it and more ways of asking those questions. So I want to jump into a bit of a conversation about how life experiences actually shape coping, because this is a really significant thing to understand, that historically we've just thought everyone experiences trauma, or it wasn't that bad, or, why can't people just get over their traumatic experiences? And I've really come to be not only curious, but passionate about understanding and helping others understand the impact that traumatic experiences have. And trauma isn't just in the event or the memories or the story of what happened. Nervous or traumatic experiences actually have their biggest impact on our nervous system, on the operating system of our brain and our entire body. And what trauma does is it activates our nervous systems into a fight, flight, freeze response. There's other responses too, but those are the three that we're most familiar with. And when traumatic experiences happen and they activate our nervous system to that degree, the trauma symptoms that are experienced are actually as the result of that nervous system response not settling. And when the nervous system doesn't settle, it creates a whole pile of problems. So the nervous system stays in a survival response. It stays locked in a fight response, flight, anxiety. It stays in a freeze response, shutting down, or a fawn response, a people-pleasing response. And those create patterns that just stay escalated or elevated in the nervous system. And often substance use and addiction disorders are an action meant to soothe something that's a leftover from the trauma responses that have not been resolved or healed, and they're staying in that activated response. And so one of the best studies that I've ever been exposed to was one done in the 90s, and I hope many of you have heard of it, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, done by Doctors Anda and Felitti. And they studied 17,000 adults, and because they were curious about what happens, what's the outcome of traumatic experiences, and how do they show up in the lives of adults? So they surveyed 17,000 adults, and they had identified 10 different types of trauma. Now, these aren't the only types of trauma that people experience, but these were the 10 that they identified for this particular ACE study. And it included things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse and neglect, parental addiction, parental mental illness, violence in the home, incarceration of a parent. And I can't remember the other one, but you get a sense of which of the ones are really common in the lives of our clients and the people that we support. And what that study did is it then asked people, how many of those 10 ACEs, adverse childhood experiences is what ACEs stands for, how many of those adverse childhood experiences have you experienced? Not how many times, but how many of those 10 categories, right? How many categories, abuse, neglect, parental addiction, parental mental illness, have you experienced? So you get a number between 0 and 10. And then they started asking questions like, how old were you when you first started smoking? What's your struggles with substance use? Are you somebody who's, at that point in time, injection heroin was the most significant drug of use that they were surveying at that point in time. So whether somebody used injection drugs, there were questions about health, about diabetes, about heart conditions, about educational outcomes. And here's what they learned about the ACE study. How many adverse childhood experiences has somebody had, and the correlation to addiction disorders? And they found that somebody with 4 or more of those ACEs were anywhere between 4 to 12 times more likely to have a substance use disorder than somebody with an ACE score of 0. So that tells us that trauma is, the connection between trauma and addiction disorders is what medical professionals calls dose dependent. The more you have of that, the more likely you are to have this. So the more trauma a child experiences, the more likely they are to develop an addiction disorder. We know that from the stats even of post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is found in about 7% of the general population in North America. It's higher in countries where there's active war or in places where there's been natural disasters. But generally speaking, PTSD sits at about 7% of the general population. That number is significantly higher in addiction treatment centers. The number of people that have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder that are seeking treatment for addiction disorders is, I've heard many different statistics, and I would bet it varies based on the type of treatment center, but it's anywhere from 30% upwards of 60 and 70% of people in a treatment center have PTSD. So that's telling us something. The other piece that I want to highlight here is really that when children grow up in homes where there are any of those ACEs, any of the challenges for their parents to show up as caregivers, and it doesn't even have to be traumatic or intentional, We have a lot of families that are struggling with like the stresses of immigration, or single parent families, or families that face financial challenges. So both parents are working. And when we have that kind of chronic stress in childhood experiences, along with any of those ACEs, what really happens is a child doesn't have enough adult or caregiving support to learn how to emotionally regulate. They're experiencing stress and trauma, and there is no adult helping bring support and helping their nervous system learn the skills of regulation. Children only learn emotional regulation skills because somebody regulated enough helped them learn it. Children do not learn how to regulate themselves emotionally in a family system or in an environment where they are stressed and nobody's helping their nervous system learn how to cope with that. And so that's one of the things that really contributes to substance use and addiction disorders. When somebody hasn't learned how to regulate, they start learning that substances and behaviors help them do that, help them cope, help them numb something. And so I hope you're making the connection that addiction disorders are really more of an adaptation to stressors, as opposed to something pathological or something wrong. Somebody who develops an addiction disorder in their early adolescence, and we all know from our client histories that that's when most addiction starts, is 11 and 12 and 13. Kids are starting to use alcohol and cannabis, and those are the ones that are at risk for long-term substance use disorders. They're just trying to survive. They're just trying to cope without a lot of support and a lot of help. And people are missing what it is that's going on for them. And so it's important to recognize that it's an adaptation, it's a survival response, as opposed to them doing something wrong. Yes, it is. It has harmful consequences to their health and to their life, but they're doing it to cope. And that's the piece that we really need to understand. And so I want to go back to the two people that I spoke about earlier, the 60-year-old man. It's clear he grew up in a family where there was no regulation. There was none. In fact, the people that were supposed to offer support and encouragement and regulation to him didn't. And they did the opposite. They actually were sources of harm and danger and unsafety in his life. And so I can honestly say to him, it makes sense that his trauma symptoms that are things like hypervigilant, and he doesn't trust anyone, and he finds it hard to reach out for help. Those responses make sense when we understand what his childhood was like. Or the 40-year-old woman who's that medical professional. She grew up in a family system that was very perfectionistic and image driven. And while there was more connection and less of the significant traumas that the 60-year-old man experienced, that shaping of her nervous system to try to be perfect on the outside, to meet people's expectations, to not let anyone down, she'd never learned how to regulate that sense of self. And so shame shows up for her often when she feels like she's failing. And that was never something that she was helped to regulate or to understand, or to realize that her personal self-worth isn't in how fast she can do a marathon or the Christmas dinner she can cook for her family. And so alcohol gives her a break, and it starts to make sense when we look at it from that lens. Let's put up the next slide for a second. So here's the question that I often encourage people to have is, how can we have a little bit more curiosity instead of judgment? And judgment really shows up in questions like, why can't they stop? Why do they keep relapsing? Why do they, the minute they get out of treatment or after they've been in recovery for a period of time, why did they make that choice? Why do they make that poor choice? Why don't they use the coping tools that they've been given? Why didn't they call their sponsor? Why didn't they practice those relapse prevention tools that they learned at some point in time? And the challenging thing is that those types of questions increase shame. They increase the painful reaction that somebody's feeling, that they feel judged. And one of the things that I think is so important to our health as humans is healthy, safe relationships. We flourish where we have relationships where we are loved and accepted, where our mistakes we're given opportunities to repair and rebuild trust, because let's face it, human beings, we're messy people and we mess up a lot. And when there's been a history of trauma for somebody, there's so much shame. There's so much of a sense that I'm defective, that I'm broken, I can't do anything right. And questions like this, questions that come at it from the standpoint of putting blame on the person, that they somehow didn't do something right. They made a poor choice. And not that those things aren't true. They didn't make the right choice in that moment. But when we lead with questions like that, it's a bit more challenging for them to feel safe, to feel like they have the sense that they're going to be seen and not judged, for that sense that they might be supported and not penalized, right? And that whole piece of emotional safety that curiosity can create provides much more of an opportunity for somebody to feel like they can be honest about what's going on. And we know that a history of trauma often comes with a whole lot of secrets that someone holds, a whole lot of things that they've never told anyone, a whole lot of self-judgments that they just feel automatically. And so when we create a culture that it leads with curiosity and compassion, it is easier to start having those conversations that help somebody feel supported. I often say I don't think people that are in addiction use because they want to. I think they often don't know how to stop. And the reason they don't know how to stop is we're not getting to the underneath piece that we really need to have. And so the next slide really highlights some questions that are more about curiosity. So the next slide identifies questions that help us kind of enter into that. What relief did somebody find using? What became overwhelming when they relapsed or they reached for that substance, right? We have to get good at understanding and helping somebody identify. Was it a feeling? Was it a thought? Was it I just couldn't sleep and I needed to sleep? Was it that I was jumping out of my skin because something triggered me? The questions, it isn't just that an alcoholic drinks because they're an alcoholic. That's such an unhelpful way of looking at it. Somebody drinks because it works to do something. And let's get curious. What pain were they carrying? What hijacked their thinking? What took over in that moment that was unbearable, that substance, that behavior helped fix, helped solve, or helped soothe? And so it's really that idea that's what I'm hoping that becomes a little bit more available as you start to explore with somebody what's happening in that moment when you reach for what you're using. What's going on? What creates that need to use that substance? What relief are you trying to get? And those questions can help bring a little bit more curiosity, a little bit more compassion. Because then, if we understand the answers to those questions, we start to realize that they're using can make sense when we look at it from a survival point of view. They're just trying to survive and get through that moment that's unbearable. And we then maybe can help put them into or help give them opportunities to learn different skills, to have the tools that they need to manage trauma triggers, to get the support they need to manage their anxiety disorder, or heal from some of those things from their childhood. So let's put up the last slide for a moment. I always like these questions. What are the questions that open up recovery? What was happening before the use? Right? What was this person doing before they picked up? What did that substance or behavior help with? Was it a thought that needed to go away? Right? That idea of intrusive thoughts is really common. Were they having some type of thought pattern that they needed help stopping? Was there a bodily experience that they needed to shift? Oftentimes, trauma really lights up the physical experience, and bodily sensations become unbearable that are related to emotions, to stress, to anger, to shame. And when somebody's living with body symptoms and signals that are overwhelming, it makes sense that they're going to reach for something that numbs that. Right? What became more manageable after using? Was it a thought? Was it a different behavior? Right? Sometimes people that are engaging in OCD-like behaviors, checking, repeated washing, different kinds of things, they can help stop that with a substance. Right? So if we can get curious about what helped become more manageable, was it an emotion? Was it a bodily sensation? Self-judgment? All of those kinds of questions help deepen that ability to uncover and help somebody name what it is that's really going on for them. And then the other thing that's important to understand or to clock too is what might need support when the substance or behavior is withdrawn. So it's interesting to me that if trauma symptoms move people into substance use or addiction disorders, and we put them into a treatment program to address their substance use, when we withdraw their ability to use that to cope with what's overwhelming, we just leave them with overwhelming and no tools to manage it. And so it can be vital that we talk about the connection of trauma and addiction, and that we start helping people navigate what's going to show up when we remove a substance or behavior as a means of coping. It often means that trauma symptoms return with full force, and now they've got nothing that they're relying on. And so it can be this really helpful way of helping somebody understand that that's what's going to happen. And then they need to be given skills for regulating their nervous system. They need really basic tools to help understand and make sense of what's going to show up when the substance use or behavior stops. So we can't just leave somebody with a history of trauma with, yes, now they're in recovery, they are abstinent for a period of time, but their distress is not going to go away if we haven't helped them navigate some of the symptoms that trauma has left in their system. And I want to just take a moment to even highlight something that I think is important to just name. Early addiction recovery isn't the time to jump into the full story of trauma. In fact, I I warn people that that isn't really the best approach. Telling your story just lights you up like a Christmas tree, and you still don't have any tools to manage it. I like to teach people to wade into conversations about what's happened, and that we have to pair that ability to name and identify that trauma has happened with tools to help regulate what happens even when we start dipping our toe into that painful life history. So I'm somebody that advocates for a really gentle approach into dealing with trauma. Creating safety is trauma-informed care. Teaching regulation skills is trauma-informed care. And helping make the connection between a history of trauma and substance use and addiction disorders is trauma-informed care without having to jump into the story, which somebody doesn't have the skills or tools to help regulate that for themselves. And so it's better left for till there is a little bit more of that capacity to manage and hold and regulate those kinds of things for the people that we're working with. And so finally, I just want to come back to the question that we had at the very beginning, and then leave some time for questions and comments, which is really this idea that the problem is the problem. And I hope that I've touched on identified some of the things that are part of what might be driving the substance use and addiction disorders that we're trying to support people to change and heal from. And if we understand that the problem is the problem, that trauma, lack of caregiving as a child, or anxiety disorders or other mental health issues, the chronic stress I haven't mentioned that either. We live in a world where chronic stress is actually just a given, and our nervous systems aren't wired to put up with that kind of stress and pushing through indefinitely. That comes at a cost. And so if we can understand that addiction disorders, substance use, is an attempt to solve a problem, it opens up different conversations. So what is that problem that you're trying to fix? Understanding the problems beneath the behavior can open up whole new possibilities for healing and recovery, is really what I want to leave you with. And so I hope that this has inspired you to even be curious, to think about the people that you have worked with, and what might their stories be illuminating for you about the connection between trauma and stress and mental health disorders, and how substance use and other behaviors helps fix what it is that they're dealing with. And like I said, it's not that addiction disorders aren't a problem in and of themselves. We have to hold that, but we also have to look at what's the problem that drives that. So I hope that's given you some new questions to ask your clients or your patients. And if some of the things that I've said or this morning or this afternoon resonate with you, I've spent a number of years creating blog posts that really cover some of these things. So my website has a number of articles that jump into this a little bit more fully. There's an ebook about the link between trauma and addiction you can download for free. There are numerous articles on the connection between mental health and addiction, trauma and addiction, anxiety disorders and addiction, how shame impacts us. So there's all of these there. So hope you can, if you're interested, navigate that and find out some more that might help you in your journey supporting people. So let's jump into some questions.
Okay, yeah, just like Sarah had said earlier. Oh, also, by the way, Carrie, thank you so much for joining us and speaking today. That was some really great content that we went over. So yeah, I just want to welcome everybody at this time to go ahead and ask questions. What we'll do is just have you put it into the chat. I'll go ahead and I'll just use your first name and let Carrie know what your question is. So maybe we'll just take a minute for everyone to think of their questions. And once they start rolling in, I'll start giving one at a time.
I'm just reading through some of the comments, and I really appreciate the way people are interacting with the content and recognizing that there just is so much more that we've learned and understand about the connection between what people are trying to cope with and why they reach for substances and behaviors.
Okay, we do have our first question here from Chad, and he's asking, at what point during a traditional in-bed treatment stays it safe and responsible to inquire into what we've been medicating from? Are there readiness signs?
That's a really good question. And I think early on it can be helpful. I'm not a big fan of intensive inventories. And I often give people a drop down. So if I've got somebody in a treatment center, I would maybe lead by saying, I'm often curious about what people are medicating. And sometimes it's anxiety. Sometimes it's a history of trauma. Sometimes it is really painful emotions or different things. And so I would list the drop down menu and say, if any of those are things that you would feel comfortable talking to me about, I'd be willing to listen. Right. So I'm not necessarily doing an all out inventory because that gets really overwhelming for people. If they don't know that what I'm going to do with that information yet, if they're still mistrustful of this process, I want to give them as much control as possible in how they start sharing their story. Because sometimes people are really compliant and they'll answer the questions that they think that their counselors or treatment staff are expecting answers to without them knowing how it's going to affect themselves when they start sharing that. And so it can be, I love giving using invitational language. Sometimes these things contribute, and I want you to know if any of those have, I hope you can, feel comfortable sharing with me in your own time. So I hope that answers the question. It's really gauging what people, and some people will be quick, nope, nope, never had any trauma. Or some people will say, yeah, I had a lot of hard things happen as a kid. And that's when I would use that experience to say, well, that's enough for me to know right now. And I often say to people, you don't even feel like you need to share that story right away. That's a hard story. And um, even me just knowing you've had trauma as a child is enough to know that there's some things that have been going on for you. Yeah.
Okay, our next question is from Patty. What are your thoughts about, sorry, the screen moved, someone made a comment. Just have to find it again. What are your thoughts about unresolved grief in relation to recovery?
Unresolved grief is another thing that I didn't actually specifically highlight, but I know it was in that word cloud that I listed simply because unresolved grief, there is, we Westerners don't often do grief well. And we don't create a lot of ability or spaces. We like to have celebrations of life, not the opportunities that really give somebody permission to be in their grief and to express it. And so there is something that when we don't do a good job letting people work through that grief response, it often shows up. If you're familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, The Stages of Grieving, well, one of the first stages of grief is denial. And substance use and behaviors really help keep that denial in gear. So there's that numbing that can come. I don't have to face this grief, right? So that's one way grief is there. I think for our older adults, grief is a significant factor in the high rates of alcohol use disorders that are happening among seniors. I also would say that the grief that is experienced by a child who loses a parent in their childhood often is a double whammy, because not only did they lose a parent to death or divorce or separation, they are also dealing with the other parent who is coping with that grief as well. And so they don't have that parent's capacity fully left to help them regulate. So we need to screen for grief.
Okay, our next question is a two-parter here, Carrie. So I'll read the whole thing out. And if you need me to read the second portion out after you've answered the first again, please just let me know. So how can we educate people receiving treatment who are ready and wanting to jump into fixing trauma, but we know there are concerns about doing that without the capacity to cope? As well, when addictions work is unregulated and so many mental health professionals are not concurrently capable, how do we support that integrated approach?
Find really good care. I would agree with you that there is a lot of poor trauma therapy out there. And the whole thing that I will say is, unless trauma is being viewed through, and this is my personal lens, through the lens of what is happening in the nervous system of that person, what's happening from the standpoint of how their nervous system is stuck in survival responses, unless we're looking and providing support there, that is a problem. And we don't actually need to tell the trauma story to learn how to heal. And so we do need to be really good at vetting what is recommended by somebody. So somatic approaches, in my opinion, are better. Anything that helps create a little bit more capacity to be with ourselves in that healing journey. So mindfulness, that ability to notice and not react. The tools for managing things on the inside are always helpful. And so that's a really big question, but we're needing to get way better at helping people really hold both their history of trauma, their desire to not continue using substances, and how do we give them the tools to walk through that with a little bit more capacity. And sometimes it's that small little steps of wading into increased nervous system regulation. And whether that be polyvagal theory, whether that be mindfulness approaches, trauma-informed yoga, breathing exercises, things that help the vagus nerve calm down a little bit. These are all easier things than jumping into, I'm gonna find a therapist who's gonna help me work through my childhood trauma. That can come, but it might not be the best place to start. So I hope that answers some of it, because it's a big question.
All right, so our next question is from Edna. Suppose the addiction is a result of peer pressure. Would isolation from those peers help?
Interesting question. And I would say I don't know how often addiction is the result of peer pressure, simply because it can, experimentation often happens that way. But by the time somebody is getting into the destructive patterns that happen as part of substance use disorders, often there still is something that's going on for them. And and so it's having that curiosity to say, what is going on? And children, kids, teens aren't necessarily willing to talk to parents. And I don't know that isolation is the right answer too. I think conversations are. I think curiosity is. And it's the invitational questions that say, this pattern's concerning, and I'm worried about you. And I hope if there's something that's going on, you'd be willing to talk to me or somebody else about it. Is, in my opinion, sometimes that would be a better approach, because sometimes that idea of trying to isolate kids, trying to put more boundaries on them, can backfire and then be creating another challenge. Parents and caregivers stand the best chance of helping their child navigate those challenges when they are an ally and not seen as an enemy. If you want my personal opinion in terms of what helps adolescents navigate these really challenging things. And so if a parent or caregiver, it becomes seen as the enemy, I think their kids feel more isolated from the people who stand the best chance of helping them navigate whatever is going on, whether it be trauma created or peer pressure created. Caring parents and attuned parents and curious parents are the ones that are likely in the best position to help open up those conversations to find out what's going on underneath. So yeah, good question though.
Okay, I think that was the last question. So I know that we started a little bit late, so I just want to, give the opportunity if, one or two people had a question that they wanted to ask Carrie before we wrap things up. And Carrie, I'm seeing a lot of thanks coming in here on the messages there from everybody as well for you that I wanted to mention. So yeah, let's just give it a minute, see if anybody has another question, if you're okay with that, Carrie, or do you have something that you're running off to right away?
I'm happy to stay on the line.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, just everybody, we'll just take another minute if anyone wants to ask another question. Yeah, feel free to. All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to say a thank you in terms of people's responses, simply because this is such a huge, important, vital conversation that needs to happen again and again and again as we're trying to support people to change these patterns that they know are destructive and we know are destructive to them. It's so devastating and distressing, what addiction does to people's lives. And so this just, I'm passionate about bringing this information, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to share it with people. And may you take these questions and this information into your work, and may it be part of the solutions that are happening for people as they address what it is that's pushing that behavior that's doing more damage in their lives. So thank you, RTI. Thank you, listeners. It's been just a great experience.
All right, yeah, thank you everyone for coming. So we're gonna end the meeting now. But as Sarah explained as well, all of the information to visit this webinar will be on our website, and you'll be able to take a look at our past webinars and this one as well once it's uploaded. So again, thank you so much, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Okay.